has a major objection to that, send me a quick text and I can turn it off again. But the only thing that actually gets recorded is my screen, my camera, and I think if you do unmute yourself and speak, then your voice would be there, but I don't think your camera actually even shows up. So shouldn't be any problems with the recording. But again, I just wanted to make sure that everybody has a chance to get back to this recording at a later date, or the session at a later date. In addition, I'll be sending you an email which includes a link to these same slides that I'll be presenting. So you can take as many notes as you like, but you're going to have access to this for the foreseeable future as well. So you could just sit back and relax. This is kind of intended as a show and tell. So you could have NVivo open if you've got enough monitors or a second screen, but the way I've got it set up, it's more an introduction. So kind of getting you introduced to it and not so much a hands-on tutorial. I'm going to try and keep an eye on the chat session, and one of the questions that just came through, is it okay if another student asks that you share with them? That's okay with me. Again, there's nothing sensitive here. The only reason that I don't just kind of have it posted is that there are students involved, and again, I don't think you actually appear anywhere on the recording. You certainly don't appear as a list of attendees, but I didn't want to just send it out to the world or have it posted for all to find. So I guess I should introduce myself. My name is Paul Peval. I'm a reference librarian stationed here in the Taylor Family Digital Library, and I'm actually in a department called Spatial and Numeric Data Services. And the kind of big area that I cover here, qualitative data services, isn't even really covered in that name, but I am the campus person to provide support to this piece of software that we're going to be talking about called NVivo. Abigail, do you still have a question, or was that answered in the chat
Yes, I
there?
do. And I
Yeah,
feel
go
like an
ahead.
idiot for asking it, but I suppose
No.
this is the place. So I do have NVivo 12. So you
Yep.
just said, that we can open it up and go through it. But do I have to, when I open, I would have to open a new one? Or if I open my 12 and put in the other code, what would happen? Or are you just going to go over that?
Yeah, I will be going over that. So I'll talk about how to get the license for the current version, which is version 14, and I'll make reference to version 12. But this is, in fact, the first workshop that I'm doing, which is specific to version 14. So
Okay, so just
if you,
follow you, and when I do get it in, and then I'll just open up the 14. Perfect, thank you.
yeah, that ought to work. And Abigail has worked with me in the past and is comfortable asking questions. Please, all of you, feel free to ask questions as well, either in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself and or raise your hand. But I want to make sure that everybody leaves today's session at least with the questions that you currently have answered. So yeah, it's a small enough group that we should be able to do that. So I'm every once in a while just taking a screenshot of who is on the attendee list. So if I kind of look off to the left side there, the reason I do that is so that I can check you off and then send you the email of the recording. So that's what's going on there. I would like to take the opportunity to acknowledge that I am currently sitting on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, and to note that the city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. This list looks, well, it is a long list, but most of this kind of follows one after another, and I don't think it will be an overwhelming list, but just to give you a heads up of what we'll be covering today, Abigail's first question there, I want to make sure that everybody knows how to get NVivo. We'll talk just kind of in passing about the nature of qualitative data and what you can get out of it. So the qualitative analysis, there are some challenges or things to be aware of if you're new to this whole process. And then we'll spend the majority of our time actually in the software. So possibly even from 11 to 12, actually seeing NVivo 14, how to work with it, basically. And as I mentioned, this is intended to be an introductory session, so you're not going to I don't expect that you'll feel super comfortable knowing the software, but I want to make sure that you have an idea of its capabilities. And so you should have an idea whether or not the software is likely to help with whatever data you have. I do a next steps workshop that's scheduled currently for later this afternoon, I think 1 to 2:30. And there is space there, so you should be able to register. The link would be in the same place that you'd find it, that you found this one rather. And in that workshop, I go into it's not really more advanced stuff, but it's the stuff that people come back to me and ask after they've been using NVivo for a while. Okay, what else can I do with it? Or I've done my coding, what's the next thing? How do I get stuff out of NVivo? So there will be some things that you probably leave today still with questions, and those are usually covered in that other workshop. So and yeah, I'm just kind of glancing over at the links there. So Nadia, I'll be showing you a link to where to download the software as well. And in fact, that'll be one of the first things that we get to. I do need to give you a heads up, though. I am not an expert in the various research methodologies. I'm pretty good at NVivo, so using this particular tool. But if your prof or supervisor says that you should be using a narrative analysis, I'm just kind of glancing at the screenshot that I have here. I can't necessarily speak as an expert as to what that actually entails, specifically within NVivo. NVivo doesn't care what research methodology you use, which is kind of neat. But whenever a student or researcher says, I need to do something very specific within NVivo, I've got to follow a particular methodology, I refer to this tool called Sage Research Methods. Again, you'll have a link to this. There's a link on the research guide that I'll be sharing with you as well. But Sage Research Methods is a tool that was purchased actually with funding from the Students' Union. It was over the last number of years, it has proven to be useful enough that the students themselves, you students, have decided, this is something I want to make sure continues within the library subscription. And it's not a traditional library database, but it's a collection of articles, podcasts, videos, data sets, all around different research methodologies. So even if you just need a quick refresher, you could learn something there. But if you really need to get in depth, you could and should also touch into Sage Research Methods, and you'll learn anything you might need to know about various methodologies. So just kind of leave that as, or know that that exists as well. So today, we are talking about version 14 and the Windows version. There is also a Mac version. I do a separate series of workshops. The software is mostly the same. Obviously, the interface is going to be different between the two platforms. There are, though, a couple of features that Mac does not bring to the table for whatever reason. So if you're working as part of a team and that team has Mac users, do be aware that you may talk about something that they can't do, and I'll try and make reference to that. It's definitely nothing that is critical. There are some nice to haves. There are some kind of more experimental features in the Windows version that just don't appear in Mac, but just be aware that there are a couple of little differences there. So it's a piece of software that allows you to work with unstructured data. A much more colloquial way of saying that is words. So most quantitative software is expecting you to have something in more of a tabular format, so something very clearly defined. But qualitative research is rarely well defined. It could be interviews, a transcript, could be survey data, it could be journal articles, it could be multimedia data. So audio recordings or video recordings. It could be something that you've captured from social media, although that is increasingly harder to do these days. Yeah, and some of the next slides that I'll show will talk a little bit more about those differences. But to actually install the software, there are two places you could get it. If you're on a university machine, so a machine that is managed by central IT, the easiest way to get it is through this thing called the Software Center. And I think I can pull that up. What you'd be looking for in that case. So this is if you are unable to install software without an administrative password. This is the method that the university would like you to use. So once this comes up, and this is kind of neat if you haven't seen this before, because it will show you all of the other software that you can install on your machine as well. So, you probably already have browsers here, but NVivo 14 appears on this list, and because it's been vetted by security at the University of Calgary, you would simply be able to click this. If it was not already installed, it would say install here. And it's not a super quick process. For some reason, it takes a while, but once you get it installed, it ought to work. I did just hear from a faculty member just yesterday who installed via this method and it didn't work. The message that they got was that it had been installed somehow incorrectly. The best I can offer in that case is to then come back to the same method, hit uninstall, reinstall. It should work. So if it doesn't work on the first go, give that a try. So uninstall from this same method, reinstall, keep your fingers crossed, it ought to work at that point. If you're on your own machine, though, what you need to do is go to this link, which is Central IT's software distribution website. And what this ought to do is simply open in your web browser. And you will need to log in. And again, there's a list of software that is available to you at this method. Your list may vary depending on your affiliation with the university, undergrad, grad, faculty, but it's this top link that you're going to be interested in. So analysis of texts and other qualitative data, NVivo, licensed to May 31st, 2024, and I'll talk about that in just a second, versions 12 and 14. So you'll hit select, and there may be another screen on your end that you have to click through, but you'll see both Mac, and it's okay, so it's version 12 for Mac, version 12 for Windows, version 14 for Mac, version 14 for Windows. And again, for today, we are talking about the version 14 for Windows. You would hit details download, you get another screen, and then finally, when you choose the link to download software, that's where you get to this screen. There are only two files that you actually need from this list. So the first is the software itself. So that's the 64.exe file. So you'll hit download. And then the second one is this license key. And that is the key that you will plug into the software to say, okay, it's affiliated with the university and we're good to go. The note on the previous screen that says it's licensed through May 2024, the way the licensing works on campus is that you could and probably should think of it as a perpetual license, but you do have to plug in the new code each year. As the next cycle comes around, so May, June of next year, you will either in years past, you've gotten an email from Central IT saying, here's next year's code. If it doesn't come from Central IT, last year they did not send one out for some reason. but you could simply come back to this page and you will find next year's license key. So as long as you're affiliated with the university, you will be able to access the license key. When you're no longer affiliated, either you've graduated, you moved on to a different institution, or for whatever reason, the software will continue to run until that period is up. So end of May into June of next year, even if you're not physically or actually officially here. If you have version 12, you can run both of the pieces of software on your machine. So you could run version 12 and 14. The key is separate, so you can't simply plug the same key in. Version 14 key will not work with version 12, but you could get the key for version 12 through the same process here. Do be aware that projects you create in one version will not be workable in the other version. NVivo is backwards compatible, but not forwards compatible. So anything you've done in version 12, you will be able to open in version 14. But once you've opened it in version 14, you cannot use that same project in version 12. So let me know if that's confusing, but it's the way NVivo keeps people moving forward, I guess. So once you've got a project in version 14, you'll only be able to work on that specific project in version 14. You can't go back. You could make a copy, and if you didn't like version 14, you could continue to work on version 12 with that copy. But yeah, just kind of be aware of that. That may also be important if you're working with a collaborator at a different institution. If he or she has a different version, then you would want to make sure that you either could get to that same version or make sure that they moved along to whichever version you were on. I've been told, well, we have the license for version 12 until the end of this current cycle. I can't promise that we will continue to have version 12 after 2024. So that's why all my instruction is kind of moving on to version 14. So let me think here if there's anything else to show. So the key itself, when I download that, it's just a text file. As you can see, it's .txt. And so, in fact, I already have it here. Yes, I'll replace that just to open it and just show you what it looks like. And during the time or when you install NVivo, there will come a time when it asks you to paste in this key, and it's simply this code. So just copy that and you'll be good to go at that point and paste it into NVivo. For those of you using the Software Center, you will not be asked for the key. So that's all included as part of that whole installation process. There is one important thing to note. Version 14 is attempting to push you to log in to the servers at NVivo. The company that brings us NVivo is called Lumivero. But when you are first installing NVivo, don't hit this big obvious button that says log into my NVivo. You, in fact, want to click this little link down here that says provide enterprise key to activate, and that's the key that I just showed you there. So Nadia, question.
Yes, so I think I just missed something when you say those who have university managed computers.
Mm-hmm.
If we go to the software center and so I tried and of course it failed. What did you say we are supposed to do?
My recommendation is to go back to the Software Center and go back to version 14 NVivo, and there should now be an uninstall button. Hit that, wait for the whole thing to uninstall, try reinstalling. I know that in the past, it has then worked. I can't promise. And if it doesn't, if it continues to not work, then I can't help you with that. You're going to have to go back to central IT. But at least a couple of times, the last couple of times I've worked with people having to jump through the hoop twice, made it work.
Thanks.
So yeah, fingers crossed that that does do the trick for you. If you do want to create an account and log into My NVivo, you're not going to gain anything. You won't lose anything. But if the university had add-ons to NVivo, or you purchase an add-on to NVivo, that's how those are managed and accessed. So for instance, NVivo provides a transcription service, but it is in fact a subscription. University doesn't have a subscription to that. There's also something called the Collaboration Cloud. We don't have access to that either. Both of them are relatively reasonably priced. They're not something a poor starving grad student would choose to buy, but if you have funding for your research, either of those might be something that you look into. I'll talk a little bit about alternatives to both of those options, but that's why you might log into My NVivo. But you know, for the licensing purposes, you definitely need to hit that provide enterprise licensing key. So a couple of slides, actually, before I get into this, let me just ask, aside from the questions that I've kind of already run by for the installation, any questions at this point? Okay. So the next few slides, I just want to kind of help you wrap your brain around what NVivo is intending to do, why it's built. Yeah, just why it's built. My wife finished her PhD a few years back, and we still have a number of these bankers boxes in the house. So this one happens to contain journal articles. Think of the box itself as an NVivo project. So you've got this research project that requires you to make sense of some words. Again, those words could be in journal articles, but they could just as easily, and in fact more often are, interview transcripts or focus group transcripts, that sort of thing. But any type of word would go in the NVivo project. Once you've got your words in there, you will read the words, you will find pieces of text that have some meaning to you, and you will virtually, we'll see examples of this in a few minutes, but you'll highlight the text within NVivo and assign some type of meaning to it. And again, that's where NVivo really shines. But you know, same idea as what you would have done in print, except you're going to be doing it on the screen. And then at some point, traditionally, you would have spread all of your words out, all of your findings on the screen, or excuse me, on the floor in the spare bedroom, and you'd say, hands off, no dogs allowed in here, no people allowed in here. I'm making sense of my research. And you'd have to go back through all of those paper files, all of those printouts, and you'd find your highlights and your notes, and you'd try to make sense of it. Nothing wrong with that process. It's worked since, 2001, if not 1492. It's the way research has been done, qualitative research. NVivo and other software packages, NVivo is not the only game in town. It's the only one we have a license to, but the idea is NVivo attempts to do all of this, or help you do all of this, on your computer. So keep these screens in mind as you're thinking of your project and as we take a look at and work with NVivo. And then another example of the way people have traditionally done research in the analog world, those same articles, those same interview transcripts, somebody might have made multiple copies of them, or a single copy, but you kind of cut things physically out and assign meaning to each of the passages of text. So again, NVivo is allowing us to do this digitally. So this is an unofficial list of what NVivo is good at, and I'll follow it with what it's not so good at. But when I say managing a large collection of different documents, and documents is because, again, it's transcripts often, as soon as you can't keep all of the words in your head, That's what I'm thinking of as a large collection. So that could be like one interview transcript, more likely 2 or 7 or 14. You know, when you've got more information than you can just look at and understand, that's where NVivo is going to start to help. Think of it kind of like a project management tool. If you're coming back to your research after a certain amount of time, it's all going to be there. You don't have to really spend as much time refreshing your memory on it, that sort of thing. It's also good at allowing teams to work on the same set of items with an asterisk, which I'll address on the next slide. Discovering trends or themes within your text. So textual analysis, that's what it's really good at. Very good at queries and word frequencies across any or all of your items. So everything that I mentioned here can be performed or done to an article, to a transcript, or across all of your articles and or transcripts. So your choice. It's not an all or nothing, but very flexible that way. It does do some basic visualizations. Think of like Microsoft Office level data viz. So bar charts, some pie charts, that kind of thing. It's not terribly sophisticated, but it can do something, and hopefully we'll have time to see an example of that. My colleague John Brose, who's in the next office wondering why he just heard his name spoken, he's our data viz expert, and he and I are slowly working towards getting an actual workshop done on specific data viz for NVivo and qualitative data analysis. He's actually got one on kind of the more nebulous side of qualitative data, but we want to really focus it on NVivo. So stay tuned for that. And then it can also do a really good job at helping you understand online surveys. So something that you might have collected through SurveyMonkey or Qualtrics, NVivo can ingest that data and again help you understand it. And on one of the previous slides, it mentioned mixed methods. Often data that's collected through a survey will be both quantitative and qualitative. So you'll have the numbers, you know, how many people responded, how many of them are undergraduates versus graduates. But then you've also often asked open-ended types of questions. So the fact that there are those two types of data in an online survey, NVivo can handle that without any problem. So it's not so good at very small projects. So again, there's no number, there's no do use it for this, don't use it for that, but there is a learning curve to it. So, you know, if you've just got a single transcript or a single document, you probably don't need to use NVivo for that. So, you know, I had to come up with something it's not great at. The asterisk that I mentioned on teams working together. So the pain is if you are working and you have people using Windows and Mac users cannot read Windows project files. Windows users can read Mac project files, but it's kind of a one-way street at that point. So if you have people on different operating systems, the Windows users have to save their project in a separate format that the Mac users can open. I mentioned the no cloud-based interface. That's still technically true. The software is installed on your machine. It's not like you log into a website. The collaboration cloud add-on that I mentioned for the very first time with version 14, apparently it is possible to host a project on the NVivo servers, would still be in Canada. They've got servers here, but at that point, Mac and Windows users can access the same project. You're still working on it on your physical machine, but you're saving it to a cloud location where users from both sides of the fence, I guess, if you want to put it that way, can access and work on it without doing that little dance. So if you know that you're going to be working with different operating systems in your research group, that might be something to take a look at. I've been unsuccessful so far in convincing the university that we should have an access to that. It's a cost issue, so I've got to find somebody with funding before we can start to offer that kind of across the board. There is also one caveat, which I believe is still the case even with version 14. When you are sharing your project with different group members, even if it's all just Windows or all just Mac, you can save your project or put your project in OneDrive or Google Drive or Dropbox. No problem with that. So if you want to keep it there for backup purposes or for sharing purposes, that's great. However, don't work on the project file while it's stored in that location. So if you've got it in OneDrive, put it on your hard drive, then open it up, do your work, save it, put it back in OneDrive. There have been instances in the past where, for whatever reason, as NVivo was working back and forth to that cloud location, an internet connection got severed, the power went out. I don't know what exactly happened, but there have been instances where people have lost their work and some instances where their projects have become corrupt, and then you're kind of hooped. So keep that in mind, and do let me know if that's unclear. Just grabbing a quick question over here. So Melanie's asking a follow-up question. Not sure how to handle NVivo's prompt about auto-saving versus recovery files. In the past, she learned the hard way that she should save to hard drive versus to the cloud. So possibly one of the issues that I mentioned. When you start an NVivo project, it will prompt you. Version 14 is slightly different, actually. The default behavior is that it will prompt you every 15 minutes and say, hey, you haven't saved your work. Would you like to save it? Good rule of thumb is to say yes at that point. And again, if you followed my advice here, you'd then be saving it to the hard drive as you're working on it. Version 14 has a new option where it says, I can't remember the exact wording, we'll see it in a moment. Don't autosave. I'll take care of it myself is what it's suggesting you as the human do. But if you accept that, then you're not able to use the Control-Z undo option or vice versa. So I'm not sure if I'm actually answering the question there, but the general rule of thumb is, there is, like, somehow, even though it prompts you to save every 15 minutes, somewhere in the background, it is doing a bit of an auto save. So every once in a while, you might run into an instance where you have to, or you're prompted to use an auto recovery file. But it's not something you really want to rely on. So if you've done something to your project, best procedure is to hit the save button or wait for that 15 minutes and then, yes, do save the project work. Yeah, it's not the world's best at giving you confidence that it has in fact saved everything you've done. So hopefully that answers. Just a quick screenshot here to reference a piece of work that was done a number of years ago, so back in 2016 now. These researchers took a look at the two top qualitative data software packages. So NVivo is one, Atlas, what was the other one? Yeah, Atlas.ti is another one. There are others out there. So if NVivo doesn't float your boat, you could explore other options. They're all pricey. There are some open source ones, but they're very niche and don't kind of cover the board of what NVivo or Atlas.ti can do. So what they were interested in is looking at all the literature where researchers said they used NVivo and how did they say they used it. So what they came up with and what I'm trying to get across to you is, if you see either this type of research project or methodology and you recognize it and you know that's what you're doing, NVivo will probably help you. Same thing with the types of data. Turns out users of Atlas.ti did the exact same things, but the frequency was perhaps slightly different. So maybe Atlas.ti did grounded theory more frequently than the NVivo researchers did. So it's not that one does something the other can't, it's just what did the researchers decide to use it for. So again, the idea here is if you see or recognize that your data fits into one of these boxes, you're probably going to be well served by NVivo. And we're just about to jump into the software as a whole, but there are a couple of things I want to mention and leave you with from the slides. We today are going to be looking at the sample project that ships with the software. So what I show you, you would be able to access and play with on your own machine as well. Nadia, yes, I am recording. So, and I know that you've been here, so you will get a link to the recording as well. So thanks for coming, and we'll catch you next time.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So it's great that this software ships with a sample project. However, the purpose of the sample project is to show off everything NVivo can do. Therefore, it's a lot more complicated a project than what you are likely working with. So don't be intimidated by what you see. Know that your project, especially your early projects within NVivo, are likely to be much more simplified. They won't have lots of subfolders and sub-themes and all that sort of thing. So don't get freaked out when you see that. You don't have to try and make your project look like this. And NVivo offers tons and tons of different features. It has the ability to do an awful lot of stuff. You don't have to use all those features. Use the software to get what you need out of your data. So think of it kind of like Excel. You're aware that there are 1,001 different formulas that could be worked with within Excel, but you know how to open it up and look at a spreadsheet and sort it. That's all you need it for. So same thing with NVivo. Don't feel that you need to explore and use all of the features. A qualitative data thing to be aware of. Working within NVivo tends to be very recursive. You will find yourself revisiting the same documents and reconsidering what a piece of text actually means to you. The example that I always lean on is maybe you've got 6 different interviews and you read through the first one and the second one and you think, yeah, I got a pretty good idea what people are talking about here. But then you get to the 4th one and somebody's talking about something else and you wonder, or you will wonder, did I just miss that in the first ones? Or is this something unique to this person? In order to answer that question, you're probably going to have to go back and reread those interviews and decide, oh yeah, they just weren't talking about that. Or, oh no, I just kind of hadn't picked up on that nuance. So now I'm going to read it with a new pair of eyes and pay attention to that. So don't fret. You're not doing something wrong if that is the case. Just kind of be aware that that's the nature of the beast. I've hinted already that NVivo doesn't care about the methodologies that you use. I will be showing you how I like to use NVivo. You may sit down next to a researcher who does something different. I like to use the right mouse click. Some people prefer keyboard shortcuts. Some people prefer going up to the menus and using the drop downs. So there's no wrong way necessarily. So don't fret if you've used it and it's different than the way I'm showing you. Do always remember your research question. And this kind of goes back to that first bullet point there. Why is it that you are using this software? What is it that you're trying to dig out of these words that you're reading? And if you can remind yourself of that, that will really help you decide which features within the software to use. And then the final thing is, remember that I'm here as a campus resource. When you get my email, you'll also have a link to me, basically. There's a button in my email signature that allows you to book either Zoom or in-person meeting with me. You know, the introduction is fine and all, but once you start to work with your own data, I understand that you are likely to have questions. How do I handle this specific thing? And that's the sort of thing that I can help you with. So just, again, kind of remember that I'm here as a resource person. Jinping is asking, can we still use NVivo 12? Yes, you can. Just a reminder, when you're on the distribution website for software here, and or if you're accessing it via the software distribution, the software center, I guess, on your machine. See if it remembers my login. All you have to do is, when you're getting into NVivo, simply choose the NVivo 12 data there. And when you hit download software, you'll also see a key for NVivo 12. So that one's right here. And again, it's a different key for version 14 and version 12. So do keep that in mind. I think I mentioned, and you probably have already tripped across this guide that I've put together. So here is, and you will receive a link to this when I send out this recording, but here's the link to that same website. Know that, so I mentioned that NVivo offers a transcription service. I've put together a page here with other services, some of which are free enough that you may get the job done without having to pay. But the idea with a transcription service is if you only have an audio recording or a video recording that has the audio, NVivo works best with the written word or the typed word. So if at all possible, and if your methodology allows for it, you probably will want to get yourself a transcription of the recording, basically, and then you'd be able to work with that within NVivo. So I'm not going to go into any other details on that, but do know that this page exists. So other questions before I jump into the software? Okay. Melanie's talking about using lit reviews, and yeah, so I've hinted or mentioned that NVivo doesn't care what kind of words you bring into it. So it is also possible to bring in PDFs from a lit review. It will interface to some extent with bibliographic management tools such as Zotero and RefWorks. The folks at Lumivero actually own one called Citavi or Citavi. I'm not familiar with it. I don't even know if I know that they often do trials with their packages, but I don't know if there's a free version of that. That seems to be the one they're angling for people to use because they want to capture your entire workflow. But I do on occasion a separate workshop on using NVivo specifically to manage your bibliographic data. You don't, I shouldn't say manage it, I should say work with what you've already captured. So a bibliographic management tool will capture all of the data about the articles that you might be working with. So, you know, the citation basically. And it's a, you know, bibliographic management tools such as Zotero are great tools for collecting the articles, but not so much for analyzing the articles. So that's why you might then bring that same information, those 10, 15, 20 articles that you'd really like to focus on, you can bring them into NVivo and actually do your work with them there and again, kind of make some sense of them. So I'm not seeing other questions pop up there. I'm showing about 11:20, so I've got about 40 minutes to really get you into the meat and potatoes of the software. So I've opened up NVivo version 14, and I saw a couple of people early on saying that they're here. They've had familiarity with 12. They'd like to see 14, and they've already noticed that it looks more slick. A group I was working with yesterday referred to version 12 as that Smurf interface. This one does look a little bit more corporate. It's got kind of the nice hues, if you will. So the interface, if you're already familiar with 12, is very similar. They've moved some things around and changed the colors a bit, but I will be giving you kind of an orientation to it. This is kind of the introductory flat splash screen. On yours, you would not have a list of recent projects until you have some projects. It's these top links that we are going to be playing with today or referencing. When you are ready to do your very own project, you'll choose this option for new project. Today, in order to show you working with NVivo with data in it, I'm choosing the sample project, and that's the one that I referenced earlier. And I've opened it a few times over here. NVivo is fine with that, but you would want to pay attention to which version you are looking at. So as soon as I click this, it's going to kind of go out somewhere in the same installation package and pull together an entire NVivo project that you could then learn from or experiment on, try queries that you don't want to try on your own data set, that sort of thing. But I do need to tell you something about this sample project so you understand why it's organized the way it is and why they're using the codes that they are. This sample project was an actual research project that was done, I think, in the mid-2000s in the Outer Banks of, I think, North Carolina. A bunch of interviews and focus groups and surveys done with people who interact with, who live on the Outer Banks, but also who visit the Outer Banks and who develop on the Outer Banks. The project is called Environmental Change Down East being the geographic region that was referenced. And the researchers wanted to help the people who all came together understand each other. They wanted to find out, what are people's thoughts on the state of change? You know, have you been visiting here or lived here since the 1950s? Or are you a brand new yuppie from New York City who just dropped in and you bought a block's worth of condos? Are you a developer? Are you an environmentalist? How can we all get along, basically? And so once we start to get into the codes, the themes of this research project all relate to those themes. Okay. So the interface here, you're looking at a ribbon across the top. So it's pretty similar, but a little bit different to Microsoft Outlook, even Microsoft Word. So when you choose one of these tabs, you get different choices here. We're not going to be in most of these areas, but do be aware that you've got different choices here. On the left-hand side is a toolbar. I've got to figure out the official names here. They've kind of separated it now, so you've got import, organize, and then explore. We're going to be spending our time on the data, so import data and files, and then the coding and the codes. The next steps workshop is where I spend more time on cases and also on queries, so getting stuff back out of the software. But under files, this is where the documents that you are going to analyze will live. And again, in your project, you're probably just going to have X number of documents under the files area. In this sample project, they've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different folders, and then even some subfolders. So don't expect that you need to have that many. I'm probably just going to play in the interviews folder. Here they've got, looks like 14 different interviews. And that's probably what you're going to have as well, just a list of documents here. To get documents in, any number of ways that you could do so. I'll count. I'll bet there's 4 different ways. So as I mentioned, I like to hit the right mouse click. So as soon as I do that, I'm in the files area or the interviews area. In fact, I'm going to do it from files just because it's a cleaner place. But if I right mouse click, I can say import items and then simply browse my computer. It's going to come up with the files area here. And so I'm going to just browse to sample PDFs in this case. And all I'd have to do is choose one, or I think I can do multiple. Yeah. So now I've grabbed 3 of them and I can just say open and they will be imported. I could have also dragged those documents in. So if I had my window here, I could just grab one of these things and drag it in. And again, I'm showing PDFs, but it works the exact same way for Microsoft Word documents or text files or whatever it is that you might be dealing with. If NVivo can't handle it, it will tell you. I don't know what the heck that is. I can't import that file type. But in this case, I've now got a whole series of PDFs. All I'd have to do is double click on one of them and it would open up. And so this is kind of the final view of the interface that you'll become familiar with. You've got the great big box over here on the right-hand side, and that's where most of your actual content will appear. Then oftentimes you'll have this kind of intermediate table of contents kind of thing happening, and then again back to your full structure, your toolbar area, if you will. So that's files, and again, as I mentioned, I'll probably be working with these interview files because they're the most typical thing that people deal with, kind of some sort of Microsoft Word document. Note that as I've opened a couple of different files, so I have that PDF that I opened, and now Charles's interview, it's a tabbed interface, very much like a web browser. So you might lose your place, but remember that you've got these different tabs here. You may end up with too many of them. You can close them. You can leave them open. It's okay. It doesn't really matter. So that's the documents. Now, where NVivo is different from anything else you might have used is with these codes. So under organize and coding and codes, these are the themes, if you will. And so I refer you back to one of my introductory slides where I said I'm not an expert in research methodologies. Some of the terminology I use in this section may not be technically correct academically, I guess. So I'm referring to each of these as a theme. NVivo refers to them as codes. You could think of them as subjects. Technically, I guess they probably should be called codes, and ultimately your codes could be grouped into themes, but in my brain, I think of them as themes. So for instance, all of those things that I talked to you about where the researchers were asking the residents, the developers, the visitors, what are your thoughts on real estate development, the sense of community in this area? And then again, you could have sub-themes. These are called parent and child themes or codes. But chances are in your first projects, you're going to have a much more flat structure. At any point, you can move these things around, though. So if you start with a flat structure and then realize you've got some things that kind of fit as a sub-theme, you can then later move them around and do that. So almost never does NVivo make you stick with what you started with. So you can always experiment and rename and move things around. And again, you could decide that you've got things that fit somewhere else later. So, you know, maybe landscape, you decide, oh, actually that's infrastructure. So what you could do is just highlight that and move it. And in a second, it now appears under infrastructure. And then you could decide, oh no, that was a mistake, and stick it back under natural environment. So again, you're not stuck with anything. Okay, so just double checking over here, codes, themes. Yeah, so some talks on terminology, and yeah, so Katrina or Katerina, they have in fact dropped nodes from the terminology. So under codes, or sorry, under coding, you have codes. It used to be under codes that you'd have nodes, and that was, you know, how many things do you want to call these things? So that's why I just kind of lump them all there. Yeah, nodes no longer are referenced within the software. I guess that's a good thing. I like it. All right, so we've got some structure here. We've got some documents. We want to analyze these documents. We want to find some meaning within these documents. So here is how NVivo works at this point. I have an interview open. I want to read this interview with my own researcher's eyes and keeping in mind my research question. Why did, it looks like Linda, why did Linda interview Charles? She wanted to, well, she asked these questions, but what we're interested in are Charles's words. And so let's just take a quick peek at what he's talking about here. She asks, what attracted you to come here? Other places you could have picked. So he's got friends who lived here, et cetera, et cetera. Somewhere in the project, there's probably information about how long Charles has lived here. He may even ask or answer that elsewhere. But the idea is I find some words that have some meaning to my research question. If I decide this sentence has meaning, if it's something that I care about, I highlight it. I just take my mouse and highlight it. And then I tell NVivo, based on these themes, which I haven't shown you how to build, that'll come next, what does it mean to me? And so I'm going to say he's lived all over the country. I miss the salt water. I'm going to call that local identity. Maybe not a perfect fit, but in this case, all I have to do is take the highlight and drag it onto local identity. And I got a little quick pop-up that says it's been coded there, and then it disappears. That same piece of text might have multiple meanings. And NVivo allows for this. You don't have to do this, but it's certainly an option. That same piece of text could also mean a sense of balance. So I just take that same piece of text and stick it on balance. And I can do that on 7 different things, one thing, any number in between, whatever it means to you. By the same token, it's up to you and or your research methodology to decide how much of the text you should capture. I grabbed a sentence. Maybe you have made a decision that at all times you need to capture an entire paragraph, an entire response. You can do that, or you don't have to do that. Most people usually stick with a sentence or two, whatever the chunk is that creates some meaning. If you decide this whole paragraph means something, you just drag that over there. If you decide, and this is one of the ways that you could build a new code, if you decide, oh man, this is something I've not seen before, I can drag that whole thing just down to the blank area. So not onto an existing one, and NVivo is going to say, oh, you must be looking at a new code. And so I'd say, yeah, this actually is now talking about pumpkin spice. If I could spell. And NVivo will automatically create a new node, a new code called pumpkin spice. And you can see from the numbers here that it has already added that chunk of text to it. So just a quick note on what these numbers are referencing and what they mean. So I've got 2 columns here. The first one is showing the number of files, so the number of documents where this code appears. In this case, this is the first time I've found anything that relates to pumpkin spice, so it only appears in this one document. As I go through the other interviews and I find that Betty is also talking about how much she hates it, and I code that text, it'll say now 2 files contain that piece of information. The number of references is telling you the number of chunks of text that you have selected. So you'll notice on most of these that the number of references is always higher than the number of files. And that's because any one file is likely or could contain multiple instances of a piece of text that relates to that concept. So if I go on further down and find that down here, the pristineness of the water is what relates to the excellent taste of pumpkin spice, I can take that, drag it onto pumpkin spice, and now it says there are 2 chunks of text. NVivo 14 actually has a new way that we can work with those codes. And that is all the way up here at the top, there's this little checkbox that says code panel. And you may find, I personally don't see the advantage of having it over here, unless maybe your mousing kind of works better that way, as opposed to over here on the left. But you could decide to code by dragging off to the right there. And you get the little kind of confirmation that something has happened. But what you don't get is an easier view of those numbers. So just be aware that it is another way that you could code that was not available in version 12. So you can kind of open that up and see what's going on there. So maybe it's easier to see if you do have lots of different subfolders. I noticed that it is a little bit more compact over here, so that may be a reason to use that. A note about these numbers, qualitative data is more about the words, the meaning, what was said, not how often something was said. That counts, but not as much as what specifically was said. So as we look at these numbers, NVivo can count, so it does, but you might glance at this and say, okay, so real estate development appears in 27 different files and 313 times. Natural environment, 24 files, 325 times. So maybe that plus the economy, that's what it's all about. And chances are that's pretty close to it, but maybe the words that were spoken in balance, even though far less frequent, only 7 files and 17 references, maybe that's really the guts of what you discovered here. So don't get swayed just by the fact that somebody or somebodies talked a lot about a topic. Always remember what it was that they were saying, and don't forget that the words that were spoken are just as, if not more important than how often they were spoken. So just kind of keep that in mind. Can I show again how to open the code panel? That was while I'm looking at a document. Just up here at the top of the document is the code panel. It's also possible to edit this file, so you get a little bit of Microsoft Word editing abilities. Like if you find a typo, you could change it here. Big word of warning: if you're working as part of a collaboration, so if you are working with co-coders, and if you edit one of your documents and your collaborator does not, NVivo will not understand that you're working on the same document. So my advice is don't use the edit button here. Fix any typos that you have before you bring them into NVivo, and then make sure that everybody in your collaboration is working from the same documents. You can still work around it, but if NVivo it brings in your partner's work and you have tweaked the documents, it's going to be a lot messier. NVivo doesn't understand that you are in fact coding the same document. So just kind of keep that in mind. The other thing that you'll find up here at the top of the document, some of you are saying, okay, yeah, I understand you coded some text, you dragged it over there, but as I'm looking at the document, it doesn't leave a highlight behind. And if you think about it for just a minute, they certainly could have, except for the fact that when you take a piece of text and assign it to multiple meanings, what does NVivo do then? Is it double highlighted? Does it put an orange on top of a blue? And what color does that turn into? So they decided not to leave highlighting on the text. They operate with this concept of coding stripes, and you can access it from at least 2 places. The new place is, again, right up here next to where we saw the code panel. The other is a slightly bigger option up here. But the idea is, when I choose this, it's going to show me a new pane off to the right-hand side there. Here's my pop-up. So save reminder. It's been more than 15 minutes since your last save. Do you wish to save your project? I'm going to say yes. And I recommend you do the same. So the coding stripes, let me just show it. So the default is none. Remember, This project is way more complex than anything you're going to be dealing with. So you're going to see way more coding stripes off to the right-hand side. But what they're attempting to do is show spatially directly across from any given piece of text where that text has been coded. So as I go through here, somewhere in here, and I could say, just show me the pumpkin spice, but what you're expected to do is kind of turn your head a little bit, read the codes which appear at the top, and then see the stripe. So here's a tiny piece of stripe that refers to local identity. And if I click on that, it then highlights the pieces of text that relate to local identity. If I decide, okay, now I want to see whatever that, let's find another one, pumpkin spice, there it is. It's yellow. The colors have absolutely no meaning. It's just a way to keep your eyes seeing different stripes. But when I click on pumpkin spice, now I'm seeing all of the text that I found that means pumpkin spice. This, I find, is more of a little bit of a crutch. It can be a useful way of seeing some overlap. So in addition to my assignation that this means pumpkin spice, I can see that it's also been coded as referencing Harker's Island. Here's a little bit of the same piece of text that references Charles mentioning Harker's Island, and there may be other meaning associated with that. But in the long run, I rarely actually look at these coding stripes. What you would eventually end up doing is saying, you know what, I want to find all the pumpkin spice that I found throughout all of my documents. What you do is come back to the list of codes, double click on the code in question. I'm going to get a new tab that opens up. And here it now shows me all of the words that I found, in this case, just in this one document, but all of the words that I have found that talk about pumpkin spice. It's actually referencing the original source. So this is a hyperlink here. Let me choose one that actually has a few different entries. So local knowledge, when I double click that, it's referenced in 5 files and 7 times in those files. But the way you can see that is, so it's Dorothy's interview, and here's the chunk of text, Margaret's interview, and here are 2 chunks of text. And if you then want to jump back into the original interview, I can click on Margaret. This is a single click in this case. Again, it's like a web hyperlink. It's going to take me to Margaret's interview. So I've got that tab there, and it's highlighting the text from whence I came, which was local knowledge. So here's the first one, and then somewhere down here is another piece of text. So, you know, the coding stripes will let you verify that what you have just done is being recorded by NVivo, but in the long run, I think you'll learn to trust NVivo and probably not look at that as often. But then, yeah, kind of come back in here. So somebody's asking about why they indicate coverage of these text in percentages. Great question. So that's referencing back here. So Margaret's interview, 2 references coded, and that's 5.85% coverage of the entire document. This one is 2.23%, 3.6. I don't know. NVivo can count, so it does. It's a computer, or it's a program. It's one easy thing for it to tell you about. But yeah, I'm not aware of any methodology that would indicate or ask you to indicate that it has a certain percentage of coverage. It might turn out to be useful if you say, you know, the majority of my people, over 50% had coverage in this area, or this one document contained a node that appeared that you know, that much coverage. But yeah, it's an interesting observation. It's not going to be anything that's important to you, I think. All right, so 15 minutes to go. I'm going to stop and ask for questions, take a sip of water, make you not listen to me 1,000% of the time. But then I do have a couple of other things to show you. So questions first, please.
Quick unrelated question. If I have NVivo transcription that I got and I've been using it with my 12, will it just automatically go on to my 14?
I believe so. So yeah, if you purchased a subscription package from NVivo, it ought to work for both of them.
Perfect, thank you.
Mm-hmm. If any of you are wanting to try it out, I think you can get a 10 or 30-minute worth of trial. So it would code or sorry, transcribe 30 minutes worth of audio, and then you could decide, is it of high enough quality? Does it do a good enough job for me to verify or to validate that cost? All of the machine, and NVivo's version or offering is a machine transcription. All of them are probably pretty similar in their quality. The quieter the environment, the more clearly your people spoke, the quality of the recording, the lack of accents, all of those will lead to an improvement in an automated transcription. None of them will be 100%. They're getting pretty good around the 95% if you've got high quality stuff. Most of them will do foreign languages. Some of them are English only. But in every single case, you would still want to eyeball what you got back and probably fix names or localizations or who knows what. But okay, so Dee is asking about stop words, and that actually does appear in my next steps workshop. So that's not something I may reference it, but I won't be getting into great detail on that. So let me show you some of the kind of interesting outputs that NVivo can do. So 90% of what you're going to be doing is reading text, highlighting text, and saying to NVivo, this is what this text means to me. So you're going to highlight it, drag it. You can also, I mentioned there's lots of different ways that you could do something. So one of the other ones is highlight the text and then come down here, and you could start to type that this means landscape, and it ought to somewhere in there. Yeah, it should have kind of brought up the landscape, but maybe the fact that it's under natural environment is confusing. But just be aware that if your mousing doesn't work, if you don't like the dragging, there are a couple of different ways. Again, you could right click code selection and it will walk you to the location. But what I wanted to do is show you kind of one of the ooh-ah things that NVivo can do. It's not like the be all and end all, but again, it's something that NVivo can do that's pretty darn simple, and that is to do a word cloud. It can do, basically it builds a word frequency, so you can look through any or all of your text, see what words are spoken most frequently, and then display that in a way that makes some obvious sense to people. And it's possible to do that across, say, an entire transcript. But where I think it is a little bit more interesting is if you do it across any given node or a series of nodes, and you want to say, what do all of the people who are talking about infrastructure, what are they saying that is kind of like always popping up, if you will? So let me just show you one of the ways to do that. If I go to the Explore tab and then choose word frequency, the default that comes up in this little wizard is this very first thing where it says search in files and externals, and that's kind of highlighted right there. The default is it's going to search everything in your project. And again, maybe that is your intention, but I'm going to show you how to focus on one specific thing. And it may turn out that this is too small and it may not actually even show me anything, but we'll find that out. What you can do is instead choose selected items. And in my case, I am going to choose a specific code. So I just want infrastructure. And I'll say OK. The default, again, is to show the 1,000 most frequently occurring words. And I think that's a bit much. That's like expecting you to go to the 17th page of your Google results. So I like to get a much more manageable number. So 50 most frequently occurring words. And then note this slider over here. I'll be playing with it in just a second, but note that by default, it's looking for the word in question. So talk. It's possible to kind of relax that or expand that. So the examples they've given here are pretty obvious, I think. So talk, or the stemmed words of talk, talking, talkability, talkers, and your results will vary depending on how far down you move that slider. But I just want to show you how that works. Once I've made my choices here, I'm going to hit run query. And so it's looking specifically at this node of infrastructure, which comes across 11 different files and has 43 different chunks of text. I don't know how long those chunks were. Again, it could have been paragraphs, it could have been individual sentences. But what NVivo has done for me is it found the most frequently occurring word of water. The length of that word, it's a computer, it can count. The count of that word, that's what I'm interested in. So water appears 27 times, people is 18, then get and sewer and system and land and septic. So when we're talking about infrastructure, I've already discovered, okay, so people are talking, like, I guess, about underground kind of infrastructure. It's not so much the buildings, according to what I'm seeing here. But two things to pay attention to here. First, this great big yellow warning: query words exclude project stop words. Add or remove stop words in project properties. So again, somebody had asked whether I'd be talking more about stop words. Know that commonly occurring words such as and, the, not, but, him, her, these things are already excluded. There is a built-in stop words list in the project properties. And so those words will never appear here. You can add words to the stop words list. So if you decide that the word get in this context is noise, you can right-click, add to stop words list. It's going to confirm that get is going onto the stop words list. And then the next time I run the query, that word will be excluded. So as soon as I hit run query, get will disappear, and NVivo will consider that as kind of an invisible word. It is possible, and again, see me for the next workshop for how to get them back out, but you can tweak what's on that list. So just be aware, though, that there are words that appear in your documents that don't appear on this list because they're kind of noisy words. Remember where the coding stripes appeared, all the way over to the right-hand side of your screen. NVivo likes to make use of that real estate. So right now we're looking at the summary, which again are the words and the counts, but this is one of the places that you can get to that actual word cloud. So this is the exact same information, but graphically represented. So in just a moment, we'll see the words with the most frequently occurring word being the biggest on the screen, followed by those that follow down. So people, water, and sewer are the biggest. Those appear most frequently. In fact, I would have thought water would be even bigger because it appeared that much more frequently than the other two. But the idea here is to draw the eye to the most frequently occurring words. So that is what is appearing in the concept or the code of infrastructure. I can right-click this and export the word cloud. So it's just going to spit out as any number of different file types. Probably PNG is a safe one because that will scale nicely. And again, I can get back to my summary, and just to show you, if I took that, say, synonyms. So think, what would synonyms to water or sewer be? When I run the query, the word list may change. So it takes a second to kind of resettle. But what I can see already is that water now I'm guessing that this may have come from a Twitter data set, sorry, X. So I have @water and water. Going is the next biggest, but it's actually consists of all of these different words. Land consists of farm, ground, land, shore, soil, state. And so again, your word cloud may change a little bit, and maybe that's great, but think, what is it that you're trying to convey with this particular graphic? You could change to some extent. You can't say it has to be a very specific font, but up here at the top of the screen, there are a couple of different ways you could show the same piece of information. So a quick note that under that Explore tab, I could also search for specific text. So again, the default is that it's going to search through everything. I know that I dragged in some documents that were unrelated to this. So I think, in fact, if I were to search for Calgary, it will find those documents, and it doesn't even take long. So yeah, so some of those PDFs that I brought in. So it found a document called Calgary Aging Population and the references. And I haven't mentioned this, but everything that we've seen so far, even those word clouds, they're all live links directly to the source documents. So when I now click on Calgary Aging Population, it will show me where it found the word Calgary. So great for kind of dipping in, surfing through your documents. And this gives me an opportunity to show that for a PDF, it works the same way. So highlight some text, drag it over, and I've now highlighted that text or indicated to NVivo that it has that meaning. So that's everything I've got. We're at 12 noon. I can stick around and answer questions if you've got them, but otherwise I'm going to wrap this up. Know that you'll get a link to the recording, to the slides, to that research guide that I've mentioned a couple of times, and also a link to that opportunity to book me if you do have if you do want to meet and talk about your project as a whole. Where is my recording? I want to stop that next. And yeah, so that's what I've got. Thank you for your time this morning. Where is my recording? Stop recording. So if you've been